Hello my friends, Takuya here, and welcome back to another alternate history question Hearts of Iron 4 video. My friends, thank you so much for your support to my previous videos, and today's question comes from a user who had asked, well, basically what if Italy had actually been competent back in World War II? Great question. Let's see how that plays out. Using the logic of the fact that this whole thing is a video game, there have been many different creators that have showed different paths for Italy and how incredibly broken they are. I am one of them. Do you want to rig the entire system and conquer the world, recreating the Roman Empire in the span of just like 2 years? Yeah. You can do that. Which for all intents and purposes should not be possible, and Italy really knows this. Oh, Mussolini, you sad square you. The problem with the scenario that we're going to get into from the very beginning when talking about Italian competence is that technically speaking, Italy wasn't necessarily incompetent during World War II. It was underprepared, severely so. The start of the game begins on January 1st, 1936. It is literally only just over 3 years before the war goes and breaks out across Europe, and Italy was not prepared for this at the time for conflict to really begin late 1939 going into 1940. From a historical perspective talking about this, Italy wanted to go to war. They wanted to be able to take territory in France. They wanted to recreate Greater Italy. That was always the plan. But from dealing with the Germans, they didn't anticipate that war was actually going to happen until 1942, hopefully 1943. Only by then was Italy going to actually be prepared for war. Meaning that when the conflict broke out, now Italy actually had to do some fighting, their troops were not ready. Like, not ready at all. That in turn brings us to the very important question, how are we going to change things? Starting off in 1936, we have the man, the myth, the legend, Il Duce, and his burning hatred towards anything Ethiopian. Yes, Italy at the start of things in 1936 start at war with Ethiopia. This is the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, and it is a conflict that historically in our timeline would go on for just over a year. Like, it starts in 1935, and it would go all the way until the beginning of 1937 in our timeline. This war from the very beginning is one of the reasons that Italy has a issue when it comes to infantry equipment, among other things. Their resources are dedicated towards this conflict, and yet simultaneously they haven't dedicated enough resources in order to end this quickly. This conflict, combined with the civil war breaking out in Spain, would be two things that would end up draining Italy of its resources, right before the time that they would actually need it going into World War II. Therefore, if we want to make a world in which Italy is more competent, we're going to have to change things a little bit. First off, in the lead up to the war, there was already many different plans to boost Italian industry. This plan is going to have to kick into overtime, as pretty much all resources are going to be dedicated towards the boosting of said industry. Italian industry among all the powers is arguably the weakest, with Italy and, let's see, I think Japan. Japan actually has a very small industrial base now, doesn't it? Larger than Italy! Yeah, Italy is the one with the weakest industrial base. This is something that is going to prove to be a major problem over the course of World War II in our timeline, and so that is something that needs to be fixed absolutely. That means going and building some civilian factories and getting some basic industry underway, but also there's going to need to be a rapid militarization that occurs and development of a proper arms industry. One of the key issues that Italy ran into this time, and we'll see here with this, is, while they have amazing individual companies that produce guns, artillery pieces, or specifically planes, Italian equipment was oftentimes seen as more like a luxury sports car. Many of the pieces were fantastic in quality, but produced in such little numbers and with such individual specialized parts that they couldn't really be reproduced across massive factories spread out in different places, and this meant very irregular equipment. If something broke, you couldn't get it easily repaired. So the argument that we're going to make here from the very beginning when talking about arms and industry is that Italy is going to dedicate significantly more of its resources. Mussolini is going to make it so that the Italian arms industry and other things start to combine, not nationalize, and standardize their practices. Yes, this is wishful thinking to think of in the beginning, and this is not something that would necessarily happen, but in striving for standardization, this is something that is going to increase output. And so even by starting up perhaps some state-owned industries that specifically are going to push this, like new companies that are solely specifically just standardized, this could actually help Mr. Benito. Outdated production lines are going to be closed. Yes, Italy is going to focus significantly more on quality, but simultaneously they're going to need to produce a lot more of the same thing, not just a bunch of individualized, specialized planes. All resources are in turn going to be dedicated to trying to equip the army. Every single thing that we can possibly do is going to be done. As for the focus, well, things aren't exactly as simple as what they were like in our timeline. Yes, one could do the broken thing and get bypass, Ethiopian war logistics? Yes, they could go ahead and bypass this by going and releasing Somalia and Eritrea, but we actually are not going to do that. We're not going to do that because historically that doesn't make sense, even within the game that being the better thing to do. So, even though what we would want to do is focus on, say, the Italian highways, among other things, what we instead are going to say is that from the beginning in 1936, Italy is going to dedicate significantly more resources in trying to stamp out the Ethiopian threat faster. They are not going to let things drag out until 1937, the reason being, every single ounce of time, every single bullet that is wasted here or in Spain is something that Italy is not going to be able to use elsewhere. At the same time, significantly more resources are going to be dedicated towards Italian industry, infrastructure, everything that you can think of to get the country on track. As a result of this, a major shift is going to occur in Italy at the beginning of 1936. Every resource that is immediately available is going to be sent down to the south in order to quickly pacify the Ethiopians. Every ounce of the air force, everything that needs to be done to try to end the war as quickly as possible. Not letting the war escalate is the key thing that has to be done. As a result, small strategic battles are going to be done, not wasting resources, minimizing losses, anything that can be done in order to slowly push back the Ethiopians before a decisive push can be made. It's at this point in history that Mussolini was presented with a conundrum. They needed to end the Ethiopian threat. As it says here, our troops have been stalled in the war against Abyssinia and have been pushed back in certain places. This Christmas offensive has Mussolini privately berating the military high command for their incompetencies. The Duce wants results now. He has therefore authorized any means necessary to repel the Abyssinians and to end this war swiftly, whatever it takes. The context of this is that the Ethiopians, rather than just immediately collapsing, had managed to push the Italians back with their own Christmas offensive, which eventually stalled out. The Italians would then respond with massive amounts of area bombings by plane and also the use of chemical weapons, which is remarkably effective, but it increases war escalation by 1. And this is what we were going to do. If Italy had been significantly more effective with their brutality, perhaps the war would have ended sooner. Through smart and quick maneuvers in surrounding Ethiopian forces versus overwhelming force throwing across the front line, this means that if Italian commanders had actually been a little bit more, well, patient and actually planned things better, things wouldn't have turned out as they did in our timeline. With this new success in northern Ethiopia, this is going to drastically increase morale of Italian forces and is going to show them that, hey, these commanders, if they behave intelligently, will actually be able to do something. Of course, in regards to industry, the priority that Mussolini is going to have at this time is making sure that Italian industry is on track. He was trying to do everything that he could in order to increase and boost Italian capabilities during this time, but for this, instead of wasting money initially on military efforts, if things are not being wasted as much by the military, this means more can be done to actually improve base Italian industry. And steel is the backbone of that. Of course, the Sultanate of Assa is still going to have to be dealt with, and so naturally we are going to demand that they submit to us. When this happens, it means an entire new front opens up with Ethiopia, which in turn allows the Italians to move through even faster. With Italian tank regiments quickly being deployed to the south in order to be utilized against the Ethiopian forces in the desert across the flatlands, and very quickly they are overwhelmed. Though they are most certainly extremely light and do suck, Italian tankettes simultaneously can be used against Ethiopian forces that largely don't have any means by which they can penetrate these light tanks. With the fall of Addis Ababa by spring of 1936, it would be very quickly apparent at that point that Mussolini may not be as incompetent as what history would remember him as. So it is then perhaps by April, May, or June of 1936, if the Italians had been a little bit more competent, perhaps the Ethiopians had been a little bit less competent themselves, maybe they would have fallen before it is that Haile Selassie would have actually been able to get out of the state and try to get help abroad. So it is then, my friends, that Ethiopia is incorporated into Italian East Africa. Are there smarter ways that we could do this? Yes, but obviously we were trying to play this realistically and not just game the system. And by ending the war that early in expending significantly less resources in order to deal with the Ethiopians, for once, Italy is not actually running into equipment issues. From the very beginning, that is rather huge, even while still maintaining a garrison within Italy itself. Of course, the question that is then going to happen is whether or not the Italians will truly be able to pacify Ethiopia. The Duce has publicly declared how the Abyssinians are crushed and on the run, their will broken after their defeat. Privately, though, he curses the Abyssinians for their resilience and defiance towards Italian rule. The Duce has given the order to crack down on local opposition with brute force and to institute laws to keep the population in check. He wants the entire country pacified and brought into the Italian fold as soon as possible. Yes, this is an issue that is faced. It activates the mission to pacify Ethiopia, in which within 2 years, I have to be able to get all compliance within Ethiopia to be greater than 60%. Since we no longer have an issue with equipment, this isn't going to prove to be as big of a problem. We're on local police force after all. But interestingly enough, if even after crushing the Ethiopians, the Italians had instead decided to work with more local administrations, maybe perhaps local chieftains, local rulers of the varying different kingdoms, since Ethiopia was comprised of many different smaller states that were subservient to an emperor, perhaps in giving those smaller states more autonomy, that in turn would have increased Italian stability at this time. So instead of brute force, we're going to instead say that the Italians utilized a lot of local police forces instead, local rulers to actually maintain their rule. From that, there isn't nearly as much hardship that's placed upon the population. That is why in turn, the Ministry of Italian Africa is going to be created at this point. Yes, our colonial possessions have grown considerably ever since the formation of our nation, less than a century ago. This growth has started to strain our manpower, however. There are ways to alleviate these limitations, though, by using local police forces such as Meher Meristi, Savari, Swafi, and others. Recruiting these groups would be less taxing on our own forces, and they have the benefit of being native to their lands, with all of what that entails. Recruit them. At the same time that local police forces are used, simultaneously local informants are incentivized to work with the Italians. Anything that can be done in order to taper down resistance is something that would happen. Again, they're being smart about it this time. So it is by that point, my friends, that Italy would truly have its triumph in Africa. The shame of Ottawa would have been wiped out some 40 years after the humiliation that they suffered at the hands of the Ethiopians. We have finally gotten our revenge. Our forces have proven their ability beyond any doubt, and all the world will acknowledge our might. Yes, it would also acknowledge the heartlessness which with the Italians fought, but this is true. This is where we're going to be taking another departure. In our timeline, what historically had happened is that Italy had, as I said before, very specialized individual industry that was spread across the country. This would be represented in dispersed industry. This is also the safer bet to do in the game because, well, when you're getting bombed by the British, it's important that you don't have your industry all in one place. In this case, though, Italy is going to risk it for the biscuit. They're going to concentrate their industry and try and standardize everything as they possibly can. This in turn unlocks the ability to modify the occupation of Ethiopia. Something that you can see would only occur here after actually taking the focus to develop Ethiopia. It does make sense that what Italy would likely do after this is focus entirely on its own domestic production, pacifying things in the colonies, and rather than focusing on its military, since it doesn't need to waste nearly as much now trying to produce more, it can instead focus on, again, its own industry. To that end, we are going to develop Ethiopia, followed by railway innovations, investments in Edison in order to get some electricity going, and then after that expand the national universities for research. The obstinate Ethiopians have long defied and humiliated us. Now that they have finally been brought to heel, we can develop their country and show them that our invasion was for their own good. Yes, in a smarter timeline for Mussolini, he focuses significantly more upon local development and actually earning the goodwill of others, after all of the murder. Still, the Spanish Civil War is going to happen, but what is going to change here in our timeline? Well, quite a bit is going to change, actually. You see, historically what had happened in the Spanish Civil War is that Italy dedicated massive amounts of time, energy, and resources that it simply didn't have in order to be able to prop up the Spanish nationalists. They did this. In addition to their own troops that they sent to the conflict, they supplied 660 planes, 150 tanks, 800 artillery pieces, 240,000 rifles, and 10,000 machine guns. Equipment that the Italians probably could have used later on. Admittedly, in this new timeline that we are working with here, Italy doesn't have to deal with the Ethiopian trouble nearly as much, which means, technically speaking, yes, they do have the resources to send over here to Spain. But what if Italy instead really only sent volunteers and some equipment? Yes, the nationalists, technically speaking, from this timeline are going to have a rougher line, but if more volunteers and more aid is sent from Italy, specifically with its own troops in use, versus relying on Spanish nationalist government forces, then theoretically this means that it kind of balances out, while simultaneously the Italians end up using less equipment and getting more volunteers in order to strengthen and educate themselves on the matters of war. So it is then, instead of sending over massive numbers of tanks and other things that are very very expensive, Italy would instead send over volunteer divisions of specialist forces, mountaineers among other things, that are going to be able to fight in the Spanish environment much more easily. Through these very decisive actions, the Spanish north would very quickly be pacified, which in turn would allow the Italians to dedicate more resources elsewhere. Of course, when given the option to join the anti-Comintern Pact, Italy would naturally join. There is no reason at this point for them to refuse German friendship, though interestingly enough, what was happening at this time is that there were still overtures that were occurring between England and also Italy. So the idea is that the English and the French wanted to be able to bring the Italians on board in order to outmaneuver the Germans. What we're going to be doing in this timeline, instead of following with that alternate history, which that in of itself is another fascinating alternate history of what if the Italians had actually sided with the Allies, because that could have happened. But in this case, we are still going to pursue our friendship with Germany, albeit in a more controlled setting. Of course, even with everything that is going on, with only about a year and a half left, we're still facing some issues with perhaps pacifying the Ethiopians. It's not necessarily moving it at the speed that Italy wants. For Italy to truly flourish, the Duce has a plan to expand our production capabilities. To accomplish this vision of a prospering nation, we need more factories that can sustain the growth of our bustling empire. Yes, this is something that would happen over and over and over again. It's actually interesting that the game pushes this because, yes, as I've said, in order to make any of this a reality, Italy has to rapidly industrialize. The next step after developing a burgeoning industry as well as research would mean that Italy would have to focus even further on strengthening and consolidating its northern factories. Italy, for anyone who is curious about this, faces a unique issue. The north is significantly more industrialized than the south, which is largely agriculture and very spread out. Well, one could say that we could right this wrong by going and reorganizing and industrializing southern Italy. It still makes significantly more sense to strengthen northern industry in order to consolidate things further. To that end, we're going to need synthetic oil experiments, and in the meantime, start developing things for the military. Yes, we're going to need some military factories. The thing about the Spanish Civil War is that the anarchists are still going to rise up, because the Spanish Civil War was messy. Even if the conflict gets delayed a little bit longer, or even if there's other factors that go into this, needless to say, the Republican side has significantly more infighting than the nationalist side does, meaning even with less support, the nationalists are still more than likely going to win. Though that in of itself would be another interesting alternate history of what would happen. Even with all of this, actually getting enough pacification on Ethiopia is very difficult, and the chances of Italy actually being able to do this are iffy at best. Even assuming greater competence, what would likely end up happening if they can't get enough native compliance to actually work as just a straight colony? The alternative solution of that is to just go and release a puppet. In this case, the Africa Oriental Italiana, that seems to be a reasonable thing. So if we cannot do this in this playthrough as an example, that's another alternate history what if that could happen theoretically. With success in both Ethiopia and more success that is coming in Spain, the Culto del Duce is something that would form. The thing is, at this point, El Duce is going to get significantly more popular. Already he was a kind of master of propaganda as it was, but now it's only become significantly better since Italy is going to have more to show for it at this point. And this is where another very interesting question then happens. So as many people are already aware, in 1938 it is when the Anschluss actually happened. But prior to this, Italy had designs upon Austria as an ally, but also simultaneously as someone that potentially, Italy will get its Italian lands that Austria occupies. And by that, what I mean is that, like, lands that a significant number of Italians actually live in that it desires. The reason that Germany went down the Pact of Steel in the first place, the reason why they would do this is because they were drained of so many resources from the fight with Ethiopia, from the fight in Spain, that this meant that they didn't actually have the ability to defend Austria against German aggression. And this is one of the reasons as to why Italy ended up signing with Germany rather than, say, sticking with the English. There is a very real possibility of what could happen is that Italy would do everything normally that it already did, but if it had been more competent, would have actually sided with the English and protected Austria instead of actually allying with Germany. If you want to see that alternate history scenario, like this video. In the case of this scenario, though, we are going to be going down the Pact of Steel and just working with what if Italy had still stuck with Germany, but simultaneously was more competent. Through smart Italian tactics, the anarchists would eventually fall, which would mean that the nationalists would be able to solely focus on why am I drawing a blank? Republicans at this point. Of course, the new alliance between Britain and France, sending any kind of ultimatum to Yugoslavia or any kind of action would be ridiculous. There would be no point in doing so. Therefore, going into 1937, after working on their industry for the past year and a half, and we're going to argue from from this that they probably did so a little bit earlier, even prior to the game. Italy is going to focus on building up its navy at this time in order to actually serve as a fighting force against the British. It takes years to prepare this in the first place, and so they are going to start as early as they can in order to make sure that they can actually compete in the Mediterranean. Combine this with, again, very smart maneuvers in order to be able to surround the Soviet volunteers that have been sent over here into the Republican side, and this means any kind of communist help is going to be completely wiped. Yugoslavia requests the sale of airplanes. Well, while this is something that would definitely help the Italian economy, simultaneously, with plans on Yugoslavia, I doubt that this is something that they would want to necessarily do. Still, the oldest fighters would be able to be sold, which could easily be destroyed by the new Italian fighters that are being developed by a modern industry. As such, makes sense that they would just allow this to happen. With this, Italy's northern industry is able to be strengthened, and simultaneously, we're not going to get the whole thing with Ethiopia. Even considering a competent Italy, it's close, mind you, but it's still not happening. We're at 56%. As such, it makes sense that rather than directly try to control things, if the Ethiopians were really resisting them that much, a more competent Italy likely would have released another administration to be able to oversee things, the Africa Oriental Italiana. In doing this, yes, Italy is no longer going to directly control things. Oh, wait, wait, what? So in doing this, you're able to release it anyway? Okay, not what I anticipated, but alright. I guess in that scenario, it does actually, we'll say that it does pacify Ethiopia, that it does allow them a degree of local autonomy, which in turn means less resistance. And so it is then, by early to middle of 1938, theoretically, if with more confidence, more aid, and perhaps a little bit better management, the Spanish Civil War could be over earlier, which means significantly less resources that are wasted by both Germany and Italy going into the conflict. Really, the only thing left for Italy to do now at this point is just continuously develop and build up itself, focus on itself economically, and prepare its military forces for potentially coming fight. Now, as I said though, Italy in our timeline was not prepared for war going into late 1939, early 1940. They did not anticipate that a war was going to happen until 1943, and the bad mustache man is literally tricked Benito into it. Like, in forcing them in attacking Poland without letting the Italians know what was going on, it ended up forcing them by virtue of the Pact of Steel in on the fight, though they didn't actually fully join the war until already they had taken over things in France. What we are likely going to say in our timeline is that even with such provocations, the Italians don't join in. The smarter, more competent thing for them to do is to not immediately join in on the conflict, to wait, and then instead, after joining the conflict, use that as an opportunity to be able to strike things within the Mediterranean. The whole time, they could still be making diplomatic overtures to the United Kingdom that they won't join in on the war, and this is something that theoretically they could weasel a deal out of them. Remember, this is during the period of appeasement, so theoretically the Italians could be appeased during this time period. Another thing that could have been different about Italy is that Italy during this time period had focused on developing its own kind of tank industry. Its tankettes, however, were outclassed in every single fight that they came across, with the exception of Ethiopia. There literally wasn't a point in which they were really practical, which means that while we have some of this stuff researched, by focusing significantly less time, energy, and resources into tank production, Italy is instead able to field significantly more in the way of infantry equipment, and actually being able to make sure that all of its divisions are properly equipped, and simultaneously equipped with things that can do damage against tanks, like anti-tank weaponry, which in turn is more effective than their tankettes. Way less time-consuming and wasteful. Occupy Albania. The strong ties between Italy and Albania go back millennia to the Roman Empire. There's a strong historical connection between our two nations, a connection the Duce is determined to see deepened. He wants to incorporate Albania into Italy and has demanded a swift occupation of the country so that we fully control the inlet to the Adriatic Sea. Yes, this is something that historically did happen, and even in this timeline, it is going to end up occurring. Within 350 days, yes, once Bandit War is complete, we'll be doing that, which should follow the same kind of trajectory as what it would historically. With this, Italy will start to expand upon its Balkan ambitions. The fate of Czechoslovakia occurs, and after this, Albania will be occupied. The question is, without war breaking out, Yugoslavia is still in a very precarious position and was constantly making overtures to the Germans and to try and maintain its own independence. Of course, the only one actually guaranteeing it is Romania, so theoretically in this timeline, with a significantly bigger built-up force, would the Italians actually invade Yugoslavia, or would they instead perhaps demand that Yugoslavia become a puppet? Well, first off, Yugoslavia actually accepts the demands for Dalmatia, something that is used as a force of arm and threat. At this time, if it is done in 1939, then theoretically that means that appeasement would still be the case, and so the French as well as the British are not prepared to intervene, and they don't want to piss off Italy because potentially they could still have an allied Italy against the Germans. Immediately after which, following a cabinet session that stretched into the early morning hours, Milan Stojanovic has formally accepted our demands. Our ambassador to Italian Yugoslavia will ensure that the Yugoslavian government closely coordinates with us on any issue of foreign or domestic policy. Thus, Yugoslavia becomes a puppet of Italy. Immediately followed by this, the Albanian occupation, and Albania yields. In one fell swoop into 1939, Italy has subjugated Yugoslavia. It has taken Albania, as with a significantly larger and more professional military without resources that have been wasted in both Spain and Ethiopia, it is able to present a greater force to make others around them submit. Of course, with that, it is time for the Pact of Steel. The relationship with Nazi Germany is troubled by ideological differences and conflicting aims. While the more likely scenario for a strengthened Italy is to actually go against the Germans, with this timeline, we have to actually work with them. After occupying Albania, the next step after that would be to establish the Regno de Albania. Because the thing is, while it is, of course, that Italy could directly occupy all of this territory, the smarter and more competent move is to allow another state to do so, which means that Italian resources aren't wasted, garrisoning is the term, With the Pact of Steel in mid-1939, this means that Italy will join the Axis, and Yugoslavia begins to fall apart. Yes, one of the things that would happen even in this timeline is that the Yugoslavian people, or rather the Serbians, are not going to just not do anything. They are going to specifically side against us. Naturally speaking, after some immediate pushback, the problem with this new Yugoslavian state is that they would think, perhaps, that due to the fact that the Albanian state was occupied by the Italians, they have to leave some forces in case Italy, us, decides to invade, which in turn allows for the fascist puppet state to actually take ground against them. Of course, Poland is still going to refuse the German ultimatum, which in turn is going to mean even more chaos within Europe. Poland capitulates, Germany now focuses its attentions towards the Netherlands, but Italy, at this time in our timeline now, is occupied by what is going on in the Balkans. Eventually, it becomes simply too much, which in turn allows for the Italians to join in on the Civil War. I'm not sure why that's a feature in the game here in the first place, but while the Germans request them to join the war, in this timeline, the Italians are just a little bit too occupied with things down at the south to actually be able to do anything. Still, the war does end, and it's at this point that the Italians would consider the option of joining in on Germany. Oh, but what's this? I did not even know this. Okay, so because the Civil War broke out in Yugoslavia, naturally at this point, the British are going to want to intervene in everything. So what do? They intervene in everything. The Yugoslavian Confederation joined the Allies, which in turn means that they are now a occupied state. Fantastic. Well, with significant more resources that have been built up with both the Navy as well as the Air Force, this means that the Italians are hopefully able to do a little bit more. With the fall of Paris, this means France has capitulated, the United Kingdom is all on its own, and Italy actually does join in on the conflict. At one point, the Italians were almost able to take out Cairo itself, but the offensive had been pushed back, this time with significantly better planning, more infrastructure, more ports that have been developed. Now they're within position to not run out of supplies and be able to push into enemy territory. And so with their better planning, with their better maneuvers, even with some supply issues, the greater number of Italian forces that no longer have to be spread out throughout different regions in Ethiopia to garrison it, that no longer have to be deployed into areas in Yugoslavia or into Albania, means that all energy and resources can instead be dedicated to taking out the Suez Canal. Completely surrounded and surprised it is by going into mid-1940 then that essentially Egypt would have fallen. If the Italians had behaved significantly more competently, this was very possible. Oof, it has been a bloody battle, and yes, the Italian Navy is still going to be facing significant issues in the Mediterranean, but thanks to our naval bombers, we were actually able to deal a significant amount of damage, and because of the greater focus that has been put into producing a number of these, the British Navy is gradually going to get whittled down in the Mediterranean where it can easily be struck, versus having to deal with it being further out in the Atlantic. The amazing thing is that by this point, in losing the canal, in losing this is going to drive Britain into a corner. Supplies are going to be significantly harder to reach, meaning that everything the United Kingdom potentially do in order to resupply from taking resources from India, that's not going to happen. Simultaneously, they're not going to be able to send forces over here nearly as easily once Japan is active in the field. And just as was done in our timeline, Japan is going to propose the Tripart Pact, to which we will of course sign. In fact, from what we can see, the Italian Navy has done done such a good job distracting the British that it has actually opened up an opportunity for sea lion to occur, and the Germans have invaded England. Of course, with the way that things are turning, it seems only natural that Greece would be the next opportunity to be struck, and after subjugating Yugoslavia, not having any to waste any additional resources, things are looking significantly up for Italy in this timeline. Now it is then, with forces that are not occupied by having already had to slog through the Balkans, the fight in Greece ends up being significantly easier. The Bulgarians are not out of supplies, the Romanians are not out of supplies, they're being constantly supplied and aided by the Italian Yugoslavian forces. The diplomatic approach has actually aided Mussolini greatly in this timeline, something which, combined with significantly more competent officers, has actually allowed them to go and invade Greece without needing the aid of Germany. And with that, before 1941 has come, the United Kingdom has fallen. The big difference from all of this is that in not wasting their supplies in other areas, the Italians were able to actually hold the British in the Mediterranean, which in turn, from causing them to lose the Suez Canal, means that their supplies were stretched thin for the home front, allowing the Germans to be able to take advantage of this and launch a strike while they were weak and unable to resupply. As for the peace deal, here's what I pretty much see happening. In the scenario in which Italy actually wins with this war, they have likely contributed significantly more than they were ever expected to. As a result, I can only see the Germans being somewhat generous in giving the Italians the claims that they desire, but simultaneously the Italian state is not going to be able to afford significantly more than, say, what we would have in a video game. What this means is that much like their claims on Ethiopia, Africa, or at least the eastern part, would more than likely be seized by the Italians. They would desire this for their new colonial empire. Simultaneously, the idea of Greater Italy in keeping their Yugoslavian puppets, in maintaining Albania, maintaining control of Greece, and in general this region, would allow them to create their own Roman Empire as they see it. With the loss of much of their naval forces in holding the British, I can naturally see that they would want to seize as much naval forces as possible. The big question that one would have at this point is competing for who exactly is going to take place, or rather control, of Gibraltar. Even with their alliance with the Germans, Italy would have no desire to be trapped within the Mediterranean. As such, this is a crucial thing for them to take. They would not allow the Germans to have it. Besides that, the rest of the free world as it was is to be divided between the two states. And so it is that going into 1941, the war is over. The loss of the Suez Canal and complete destruction of British trade means that in such a short time and with a more competent force, Italy was able to completely outmaneuver the British. I realized in making this video that I did actually have to do a whole thing where I annex France in order to actually get the things that Italy needed for the greater Italy. I completely forgot to do that. That is historically something that would have happened, is that they would have demanded French territory. They wouldn't just allowed Vichy France to exist. Japan at this time, emboldened by the success of the Axis, goes and still declares war on the Philippines, which in turn is going to draw the United States in. Except instead of joining the Allies, the United States is just at war with Japan. And that's it. There is no need for the United States to get involved in things in Europe, as there really is no hope for them. All the creditors, everything that they lent to the British, everything that could possibly be paid back, is gone, wiped, destroyed by the Germans, which in turn severely hurts the United States economy, and that actually makes their situation more difficult with the Japanese. Of course, Germany, in our timeline, still is going to break the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. In fact, now, arguably, they could potentially have even greater resources, as they have been able to seize everything from the British Isles, among other things. Or, alternatively, their situation at that point going into Barbarossa could be weaker. Their war against the British had been such a stunning success in our own timeline against France, everything, that yes, they occupied France. Yes, they had Vichy France, so they didn't have to waste as many resources garrisoning it. But in occupying France and the British, unless they go and release some kind of puppet state to be able to oversee things, significant amount of resources are going to have to be dedicated to specifically garrisoning this, which in turn further weakens their ability to invade the Soviet Union. Italy, by this point, sees no reason to get involved with the Germans. Instead, they have proclaimed Greater Italy. Mussolini has his Roman Empire. He is Il Duce. And that, my friends, I think is where we're going to leave off things here for today. Honestly, the interesting thing that could happen here at this point is that, again, if the Germans, by this point, have already expended so much of their resources specifically to garrison the British, which it's not going to show here necessarily in the game because they're just going to get a bunch of resources, but in having to actually garrison this and have to maintain this and having to deal with resistance as what would have actually happened in our timeline, there is a significant chance that this is in fact going to stretch and weaken German strength even further when dealing with Barbarossa. Barbarossa. And yes, potentially they are going to then get all the way to Moscow. But also, at that point, without nearly as much help from the United States, due to the fact that they already lost everything to deal with the British, Lend-Lease likely wouldn't really be a thing in order to be able to support the Soviet Union. So yes, the Germans probably have less resources going into Barbarossa, but the Russians have no real ability to recover from it. Brings up an interesting question in this death war of who would actually last. Either way, my friends, this has been Stuckui with another Hearts of Iron 4 alternate history episode. I find this whole series that we're doing fascinating. Please let me know in the comment section below what type of things you'd like to do next. As always, I will take the suggestions that are put in there and I will put them into a poll. I didn't this time because it was hands down the most liked comment that was on the previous video that I did, and as a result, I feel the need to do this and give Italy a fighting chance in the war. With that, my friends, we're ending things here today. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time. Goodbye, guys.